Hello and most welcome to 1049A. I think it will be an A. It's a bit, well, it's not the best environment, it's a bit windy today. I hope it will not significantly disturb the quality today. I have mentioned this before, but there was a great connection between Heidegger and the Japanese philosophers. Earlier, some 500 lectures ago, I did mention the connection between the Kyoto philosophy of school, or Kitaro Nishida's Japanese westernized philosophy. And I found this interesting article by Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, Martin Heidegger and his Japanese interlocutors about the limit of Western metaphysics. And it makes an astonishing, interesting example with great connections to the whole series in a twisted way, so to speak. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And I think more and more, for obvious reasons, this is going to be quite helpful for our series. This article came about since the lucky article from Casey. This fellow has the standpoint that, let me see here, how could I explain it? Well, the perfect standpoint is being that Heidegger got his interest in the forgetfulness of the Seinfrage, and that was sort of overturned into the Seinsfragen or Seiendensfrage. Quite possibly, and I would say according to Heidegger himself, that never took place in Asia. And I don't know if Heidegger himself was aware of that, but it's unlikely that it took place in any country, and not just only Japan. It is the most specific idiosyncratic tendency, the Western tendency for a metaphysics. And this is so specific, so original, so easy to point out, still at work. So it's almost like an archaeological artifact, still playing a massive role in the thinking and doing of people of this world. Let me start here, just to give you a little breath of what Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht is pointing to. This is from his article from, let's see, I'm going to put in the dates in the links. Quite obviously, the central position that Western philosophical discourses have assigned over the past 2 centuries to the concept of sense hinges upon the epistemological dominance of the subject-object paradigm. In whichever specific ways his concepts have been defined, and we all know how confusing the range of those proposals has become. It always ends up referring to the modalities in which an observer or subject can refer to what he is observing as the world of objects. Making sense then may be described as the selection performed by an observer of a specific object of reference among all the objects of which the world is believed to consist, or as drawing of a line by which he makes a distinction at every given moment between those parts of the world that he is observing and those that he is not observing, or as the positioning of a chosen topic within the pre-existing context of possible associations. All these different descriptions can be turned into definitions of making sense, of sense making, and as long as they point to the awareness that whatever has been chosen, divided or contextualized could have been chosen, divided or contextualized differently. Another way of evoking the same type of relation between what remains potential and what becomes actual would be to say that the concept of sense always refers to the cases of entropy transformed into structure, under the condition that alternative patterns of transforming entropy into structure remain available. We will call the subject's consciousness, Bewusstsein, is the place where these selections take place and where their alternatives are held available. So Western discourse always goes into the same modality. It has to be explained that way. There is no other way of thinking of the objects in the world than that they are being observed by a subject in front of an object in space. It has to take that platform. There are no known exceptions until quantum mechanics. That is, of course, a limitation in a way. Many questions cannot be asked anymore. Well, above all, the why question cannot enter anymore. And we think it's so completely obvious that everything has to take this format. It has entered all into our discourse, into our awareness, into our language. But Heidegger shows it does not have to be limited in this way. So what he is addressing with his questioning, his destruction, is not so much the grounds for this, but rather that severe limitation on thinking, doing, acting, perceiving that it makes. And maybe this limitation has become grander the last couple of centuries. But that's a view I held or hold. I don't know where I stand right now, but I did. At least I held it. If we consider the subject-object paradigm as the core element of that style of philosophizing, which has been called Western metaphysics, then it is a both true and trivial conclusion to say that within Western metaphysics, sense-making is inevitably that subjects cannot help producing sense, and also that there can be no effects of sense without pointing to a subject. Sense is always connected to a subject. It's only subjects that can carry sense according to the format that is present in Western metaphysics. An interesting case that proves the point of this implicational relationship is Niklas Luhmann's systems theory. Despite Luhmann's sustained effort to be epistemologically eccentric, despite all his great conceptual ambition to bypass the instance of the subject, his books, and above all, their reception, make it sorry there. Very clear how a philosophical discourse that gives a central apposition to the concept of sense as lumens cannot help producing subject effects. The frequently used everyday expressions, on the other hand, that something makes no sense is not in conflict with our point about the inevitability of sense making within the metaphysical and also within our Western everyday framework of discursive presuppositions. So we have a set of presuppositions. They cannot be known because everything that is known that makes sense has to enter the conceptual framework of subject in front of object in space. There are no exceptions, none. Therefore, of course, it becomes complicated, troublesome, and it would take a lot of effort to understand that there is a presupposition in place. Because if we were to explain it in the subject in front of object and so forth, it will reinforce the idea of subject in front of objects. It's interesting how complicated this becomes, since to end in this non-verbal presupposition in Japanese is impossible almost. One Japanese philosopher tried his best to explain it, but I don't think it can be explained. It can be pointed to, and if you are Japanese and never grown up in a Western society, it could be an example that sort of is the exception to the rule. Count Cookie, I will mention later on here. But if you have not grown up, I would say it's impossible to make a sense of subject in front of object in space. That's important to remember. And when I say subject in front of space, with object that is situated in space, I don't refer to something you readily can understand either. I refer to something that can be explicated with a number of neologisms, as in Martin Heidegger, or it can be deconstructed, but it will take time, and in the end you will get a feel for it, and then you will say, aha, that's what it is, and then you will understand you can't talk about it, but you know it. And that knowledge is a knowledge by doing. And that knowledge by doing is the knowledge that is normal, so to speak, in the Eastern Hemisphere. There are no other knowledges. Well, let me continue. For if we say that something makes no sense, we are not using the word sense in accordance with the conventional philosophical meaning of sense-making. And we are thus not referring to individual phenomena that would resist individual acts of sense attribution. Rather, when we say that something makes no sense, we react to situations where a shorter or longer of sequence of those elementary and inevitable acts of sense attribution does not produce an impression of coherence or consistency. We refer to situations where we lack a larger perspective from which we could subsume the results of different individual acts of sense-making. Astonishingly enough, the result of different individual acts of sense-making, or not astonishingly at all those loud intellectual slogans from a decade ago or two about the death of the subject never reached this altogether unsurprising point, that any attempt at, or the mere historical process of, overcoming a subject-centered epistemological tradition, or with a more Heideggerian concept of overcoming metaphysics, would have to ask how one could begin to avoid sense-making. On the contrary, that a weak subject and that so-called weak thinking, as which the subject-object paradigm seems to have survived the years of premature death, announcements have made sense-making even more central. I completely agree. Perhaps even more obsessive than it came to be in the philosophical past. For the difference between the traditional subject and the new weak subject seems to lie in the latter's higher awareness of the contingent character of any sense-making operation, both on the basic level and on the consistency-producing level. The weak subject indeed produces a surplus of sense due to the added obligation of commenting on his or her primary sense-making operations. Martin Heidegger, in contrast, seemed to have been one of those surprisingly few Western philosophers to have seriously pursued the non-trivial question of whether, and if so, how we can avoid producing sense on the basic level of our relationship to the world. Although the central position that Heidegger gave to interpretation and sense production in Sein und Zeit, and his description of the everydayness of human existence is not in flagrant contradiction with the question of how one can avoid sense-making. It is quite clear that Heidegger's interest in the question developed hand in hand with the tendency of his later work to conceive of his own philosophizing as a way of discovering alternatives to what he calls the metaphysical tradition. But it is even more interesting to realize that the one text in which probably he most insistently pursues the quest is a text which Heidegger tries to confront a non-Western thinking tradition. I'm referring here to a dialogue on language between a Japanese and an inquirer. Aus einem Gespräch von der Sprache zwischen einem Japaner und einem Fragenden, written during the years 1953 to 54, and first published in the volume Unterwegs zur Sprache in 1959. The dialogue between an inquirer, who of course stands for Heidegger himself, and a Japanese, leaves no doubt indeed about the author's epistemological interest in developing a critique of a number of concepts that are at the center of the metaphysical tradition. Following quotes from the book. In inquirer. To experience in this sense always means to refer back, to refer life and lived experience back to the I. Experience is the name for the referral of the objective back to the subject. The much discussed I/thou experience too belongs within the metaphysical sphere of subjectivity. Japanese, and this sphere of subjectivity and of the expression that belongs to it is what you left behind when you entered into the hermeneutical relation to the twofold. Inquirer, at least I tried. The guiding notions which, under the names expression, experience, and consciousness, determine modern thinking were to be put in question with respect to the decisive role they play. Later in this essay, we will discuss the central concepts of Heidegger's alternative epistemology, above all, the complex notion of the twofold. As a starting point, all that matters is to acknowledge that Heidegger tried to challenge and to rethink metaphysics. That is, the subject/object paradigm and its implications. And that he did so by questioning that metaphysical worldview which presupposes that there is, in the primary sense of the adjective metaphysical, a meaning to be identified beyond or under each of the material surfaces that make up the world. What, when then called interpretation and hermeneutics, are the practices and the theory of such meaning identification. From its very beginning, this critical Heidegger did not like the word. Impulse in his thinking was complemented by the search for a different relation to the world, a relation to the world that would not be exclusively based on sense production. It is probably for this reason that Heidegger quite frequently mentions in the dialogue on language how uneasy he feels about the conventional sense-based concept of language. Indeed, several passages invite us to imagine a way of referring to the world that would not be sense-related. For example, when asked why he thinks that his own and very famous phrase of the language as the house of being may in the end be an inappropriate concept for his epistemological pursuits, the inquirer, that is Heidegger, replies, because the mode of conceptual representation insinuates itself all too easily into every kind of human experience. How one could avoid positing a conceptual representation of the world as the ultimate form of human experience was no doubt a question that mattered to Heidegger. Neither the dialogical form of Gespräch von der Sprache nor the choice of a Japanese interlocutor is accidental in relation to this question, which is central to the text. Toward the end of their conversation, the inquirer suggests that he and the interlocutor have been engaged not in a dialogue about an analysis of language, but in an intellectual process that was carried and inspired by language as its basis. Ein Sprechen von der Sprache her. That is, by the specific relationship between language and being. The dialogical form of the text, then, was meant to embody the shift from language as a topic to language as an existential inspiration and resource, as Heidegger might have said. The presence of the Japanese interlocutor in this specific context stands for Heidegger's impression of an existing yet concealed affinity. Eine tief verborgene Verwandtschaft between his own epistemological institutions, intuitions, and the traditions of Japanese thought. Many incidents, both in Heidegger's life and in the reception of his work, attests to the existence of complementary feelings on the other side, at least within specific circles of the Japanese intelligentsia. This had also become evident, for example, in the invitation that the otherwise intentionally still unknown Heidegger received in 1924, 3 years before the publication of Sein und Zeit, for an extended stay as a research fellow at the University of Tokyo, and, above all, in the lasting importance of his writings for the academic institution of philosophy in Japan. That a fascination for Heidegger's style of philosophizing did exist in Japan since his earliest publication is, then, an undeniable fact, and while at a later stage Heidegger's political sympathies may have become an additional reason for his reception, I think it's fair to say that the philosophical fascination preceded these political sympathies. His success in Japan, however, seems to have motivated an interest in Heidegger, perhaps even an interest that is untypical within his intellectual preferences, and for what he imagined to be Japanese culture. This does of course not deny that much of what he referred to as Japanese were phenomena and traditions that should rather be described as typical for Asian cultures at large. From a conceptual point of view, the obvious reason for the philosophical convergences between Heidegger and his admirers in Japan must have been the fascination, felt on both sides, of the notion and the philosophical problem of nothingness. And nothingness indeed leads us back to the question regarding the avoidance, or at least the minimizing, of sense production. For the Asian idea of nirvana, as the following quote taken from a sermon of the Buddha illustrate, is less the idea of a vacuum or an emptiness than the idea of a sphere of a fullness in which no distinctions are made, no lines are drawn, no sense is produced. This is a quote from the Buddha. There is a sphere, you monks, where things are neither solid nor fluid, where there is neither heat nor motion, neither this world nor that world, neither sun nor moon. This, you monks, I call neither coming nor going, neither being born nor dying. It is what it is, without basis, without development, without support. And this is the end of suffering, end of quote. I should put in here myself also the Chatruskotti, the four-cornered logic, where there are four corners, and beyond that is this fifth corner, which doesn't include anything. But this is what makes the corners real. And the point being is that nothing can have substance if this is not acquired. Therefore, in Western metaphysics, there is no substance. There is no existence, neither is there any permanence. And this is also what Heidegger is pointing to. Even if we believe in an eternal world, that will permanently be affected by the metaphysics of presence, and therefore it will erode itself. It's a presence that makes itself unpresent. The solution to this, so to speak, it's not really a solution, but what they do in Asia, they have complete fullness because they haven't established the metaphysics of presence. And therefore their presence is not eroded, their fullness is not emptied out, their permanence is real permanence. And this is so true on a neurological basis as well. We know today, even those who believe, for them it's not positive. God doesn't give any positive feelings. It gives equally bad and equally good feelings. That is not the case in the Asian tradition. And this is also what Rodolphe Gasquet means by nullification. When you are in the metaphysical tradition of the West, the transcendent signifier will always obliterate everything that is thought, projected, or believed. So belief cannot exist as in the Asian concept, that you really believe in the God, or you believe in an afterlife, or you believe in a future that is projection, or you understand the past, whatever phrases you think. It will constantly erode itself. It's a present and it's a here that sort of burns out the here and the now. No Westerners have ever had a concept of presence. Otherwise, to quote Derrida, there wouldn't be a strive for presence if they had it. Metaphysics of presence is the lack of presence in fullness. And of course, it can never ever be healed by taking away the metaphysics of presence. That would make the situation tenfold worse or thousandfold worse. I think that would be the worst case scenario. To say to someone who never experienced permanence, fullness, presence, that even that dream of what you really, really need at your heart, not even that can be. That would be a killer. And of course that should be avoided. Therefore, I'm not sure that full-blown attack from some proponents of quantum mechanics, you have to accept Schrödinger's cat, is always good, because it's bound to give the person a sense that it would lose even its little hope. But presence, this is how I'm beginning to understand, it's a complete new thing. It doesn't exist in the West, and it hasn't done so for millennia. We don't know what substance is, therefore we look for an arch substance. We don't know what fullness is, therefore we, like Parmenides, establish absolute fullness. We don't have permanence, therefore we have all this evangelicus idea of God is present, and that is constantly hysterically repeated. So I think that's very helpful. And you see the connection between Heidegger and Derrida here, and that was also made clear with a previous lecture about Derrida, Heidegger, and Edward Casey. shown that by having both Derrida and Heidegger both are helped, so to speak, and one can point to where in Case's case, sorry for the alliteration, you can point there to he sort of discovers that Derrida wants to keep, or Heidegger wants to keep, some sort of a transcendental signifier. But it could also, as I would say, be left there for pedagogical reason, because it's too tough an onslaught, because in our very sense making, when we communicate, we use the metaphysical philosophy of presence. Transcendental signifier is important, and even if it doesn't do anything, it sort of calms one down, so one can take in what is possible in the metaphysics of presence. There is not much information coming in. We know Westerners are pretty cut off from reality, but for a very good reason. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Of course, if you don't have permanence, you don't have safety. If you don't have localization, we've shown with the Klein bottle, if you think space is three-dimensional, you are bound to be unbalanced. You could say also the other side of the coin of not being localized is being bodily unstable, not having the stability, not standing on your full feet, not having help of the ground, neither having the air around you so you can have freedom. You can have neither. And if this why question is not expanded and you try harder within that limitation that is already set, you're pretty much running in like really deep water. And if you're walking really deep water, you don't get anywhere. Actually, in the end, you get deeper. It's like treading water. The why question is, of course, the only thing that Heidegger really is writing about. There's nothing more to it. That simple little question. Well, let me continue. I'm getting silly here, sorry. Quite obviously, the existential desire or the intellectual task to experience nirvana or to experience nothingness as the absence of all distinctions, which condition is synonymous with the absence of all sense and meaning, bring up a paradox. For if experience something presupposes the possibility of seeing that something as separated from something else, then experiencing nothingness must be the paradoxical simultaneity of experience as non-separated something, which for being something needs to be separated from having something else. It is the paradoxical simultaneity of something having and not having a form. No hermeneutical surgery can fix this problem. In other words, no sense-based experience of the absence of sense is possible. In reaction to this paradox, the Zen tradition has replaced the impossible quest for the meaningful experience of the absence of meaning/sense by a certain style of absurd speech acts, which states the refusal of sense. For instance, the disciple asks what the sense of nothingness is, and the master answers by verbally pointing to some trivial object in the shared deictic horizon, or in a switch form, or in a switch from verbal to non-verbal interaction. The master hits the disciple instead of verbally responding to his impossible question. In contrast to the refreshingly drastic gesture of Zen communication, the inquirer in Heidegger's dialogue is, and Heidegger himself certainly was, too pompously academic. Far from being treated to the discursive special effects of a non-Western tradition, therefore, the reader of the Gespräch has to witness how Heidegger, for all his lifelong ambition to avoid the image of the typical intellectual and the style of conventional professor, is struggling, not very successfully as far as the stylistic quality of his text goes, with a modestly literary and hence not fully academic genre of the philosophical dialogue. The decision to represent his own position through the role of the inquirer, einen Fragenden, seems to come from the most widespread understanding of Socratic wisdom. In parenthesis, an inquirer by definition knows that he does not know, whereas the inquirer counterpart is barely characterized by his Japanese nationality, ein Japaner, not by any corresponding philosophical or discursive role. This discursive asymmetry between the inquirer and the Japanese seems to reflect a real-life situation whose memory, according to Heidegger's commentary, Unterwegs, was indeed a basis for the Gespräch. This real-life situation was a visit by Tomio Tezuka, a Germanist from the University of Tokyo who, as a non-German Germanist, was doubtlessly eager to please the famous philosopher, then in his mid-60s. Tomio Tezuka seems to have fulfilled all the very provincial standard of expectation of a German academic toward a Far East Asian colleague. At one point of the Gespräch, for example, the inquirer reminds the Japanese, somehow treacherously protecting his own time budget, that the latter's time is limited because he is planning to travel to Florence the following day, upon which the Japanese happily seizes the opportunity to offer an extension of his visit by one more day. If you grant me one further visit to your house, end of quote. Not surprisingly, the inquirer never responds, and his interlocutor does not dare to insist. The most embarrassing effect in this text, however, from a rhetorical point of view, extremely embarrassing indeed if you keep in mind the identity of the author, is attributed to the Japanese interlocutor, who throughout the conversation produces the impression that the life form of all Japanese intellectuals must be an ongoing Heidegger seminar. According to his remarks, transcripts of Heidegger's lecture courses appears to be the only spiritual nourishment in their world. Every word that the master ever said seems to have triggered never-fading echoes in the minds of his former students. And these faithful admirers are always ready to defend their idol against potentially ill-meaning enemies. Quote, "To us at a distance, it had always seemed amazing that people never tired of imputing to you a negative attitude toward the history of previous thinking, while in fact you strive only for an original appropriation." And here we come into the part that speaks a lot about Count Shuzokuki. And bear with me here, or bear with the text, because it has a magnificent point. And I think getting to that magnificent point needs to be made in an indirect manner. And I think all these things can only be reached in an indirect manner, but this is an indirect manner within the indirectness of Heidegger's texts. Whose figure, perhaps we should say rather, whose shadow dominates by direct and detailed reference the opening sequence of the conversation. Japanese, you know Konchuzi Kuki. He studied with you for a number of years. Inquirer, Konkuki has a lasting place in my memory. Japanese, he died too early. His teacher, Nishida, wrote his epitaph. For over a year he worked on this supreme tribute to his pupil. Interlocutor, I am happy to have the photographs of Kuki's grave and of the grave in which he lies. Grove. Yes, interlocutor, I know the temple garden in Kyoto. Many of my friends often join me to visit the tomb there. The garden was established toward the end of the 12th century by the priest Honnen on the eastern hill of what was then the imperial city of Kyoto, as a place for reflection and deep meditation. Konkuki will remain a central reference throughout the dialogue. After some initial hesitation, the inquirer is easily persuaded by his Japanese interlocutor that one should understand the notion of ikki, to which Kuki dedicated a book first published in 1930, and is called Reflections on Japanese Taste, the structure of ikki as the equivalent of the European concept of the arts and poetry. Another quote. Inquirer, in my dialogues with Kuki, I never had more than a distant inkling of what the word says. Japanese. Later, after his return from Europe, Count Kuki gave lectures in Kyoto on the aesthetics of Japanese art and poetry. These lectures have come out as a book. In the book, he attempts to consider the nature of Japanese art with the help of European aesthetics. End of quote. Toward the end of the conversation, the inquirer indeed goes so far as to incorporate the Western tradition of philosophical aesthetics into a now much complexified definition of ikki. For his own reflection of ikki, the inquirer had even invoked a particularly inspiring memory of the beautiful visual image of Kuki's wife. Quote, the dialogues of which I am thinking came about at my house like a spontaneous game. Count Kuki occasionally brought his wife along when then were festive Japanese garments. They made the East Asian world more luminously present. The historical truth seems to have been quite different from this very German academic portrait of the Far East Asian colleague and his spouse, but it is by no means less interesting. Born in 1888, 1 year before Heidegger, Kuki Shuzo was the son of an important intellectual and political protagonist of the Meiji period. The Japanese era of modernization. His mother was a geisha from Gion, the entertainment district of Kyoto, and this origin may have triggered the secret rumor that Kuki Shuzo's biological father was one of his legal father's employees, with whom his mother indeed had an affair. Rumor or tragic love story, Kuki's mother spent the final decades of her year in the reclusion of a psychiatric institution. Kuki Shuzo himself, after an education whose intellectual orientation was a predominantly Western, as it was typical for that moment in Japanese history, came to Europe in 1921, where until 1929 he attended lectures and seminars at the universities of Paris, Heidelberg and Freiburg, where he established contacts with philosophers like Henri Bergson and the young Jean-Paul Sartre, Ricoeur, Husserl and Martin Heidegger. It's certainly not true, as Gesprecht states in passing, that Kuki studied with Heidegger for several years. Rather, they had just a few encounters and conversations at Freiburg during the spring of 1927, when Heidegger, although he was still teaching at Marburg, spent his vacation in his former and future hometown. In a note to Husserl, he refers to these conversations with Kuki as an additional burden. The complete list of Kuki's interlocutors attests to an unfailing instinct that helped him identify who and what was the philosophically fashionable during the years of his stay in Europe. The 19th century role of the dandy that he seems to have favored as a model for his non-academic lifestyle in France, Germany and even Japan, in contrast, was quite passé by the cultural standards of the 1920s. But dandyism certainly excluded the option of marriage, and there is indeed no record of any Mrs. or Madame Kuki. A diary, however, exists in which Kuki kept a meticulous record of his encounters with countless Parisian prostitutes and their exotic tastes. Not surprisingly, this lifestyle, which for more cosmopolitan eyes than Heidegger's, could have projected an image of Kuki Shuzo as a Japanese brother of Professor Unrat from Heinrich Mann's and Marlene Dietrich's Blue Angel, was not favorable for the progress of his academic career after Kuki's return to Japan in 1929. It appears that among his peers and among his students, Kuki was above all famous for going back and forth with no detours between the University of Kyoto and the Gion tea houses. While he was soon appointed to a professorship, his colleagues obviously took him as an outsider, a man with an intriguing biography and a spotty academic record. In 1941, and without leaving an important body of philosophical writings, Kuki died an unheroic death from peritonitis. Not even Kuki Shuzo's book on Ikki, which he wrote, incidentally, during the final years of his stay in Paris, has much to do with the Japanese interlocutor and the inquiry speculations about his thought. Rather, it belongs to a discourse which, partly as a reaction to the fierce modernization efforts of the Meiji decades in Japan, and partly owing to the dominant political and ideological constellations in the 1930s and 40s, tried to grasp the essence. Today we would of course say the identity of the national culture. The name of this discourse is Nihonron, while it is probably fair to say that such a project was neither specifically close to nor particularly far from Heidegger's own interest. As a first reading of Reflections on Japanese Taste suggests that the epistemological grounding that Kuki took from the word ikki was not only different but indeed opposed to what was at stake in Heidegger's dialogue. First, what kind of relation does a language have in general to people? What is the relationship between meaning, which is the content of words, and the being of a people? Thus, where the people's mode of being is central to the words, it will appear as a definite meaning and will open up a channel through language. These sentences are remindful of a certain culture and linguistic idealism that was standard in the literature and arts departments of German and French university during that time. And being part of this discourse, Kuki's thinking inscribed itself in the metaphysical paradigm that Heidegger was seeking to overcome. But while a discussion with Count Kuki about the obsoleteness of the metaphysical paradigm could certainly have occurred, it is more entertaining, to say the least, to speculate how this very German philosopher might have reacted had he known that the erotic behavior of geisha was the central topic in Reflection on Japanese Taste. Had he known that this book included, for example, an extended and probably quite competent analysis and interpretation of the specific kimono décolletage, which reveals the nape of the neck, and that if the book showed any traces of an impact coming from Kuki's conversation with Heidegger, they lay in passion for etymological speculations, which, in their utter disregard of any philological accuracy, were even more breathtaking than Heidegger's own experimentation in this genre. A cite here. Can we perhaps discover a word which is applicable to ik in French? The word chic first comes to mind. This word is used just as it is in both English and German, and is often translated into Japanese as ikki. There are essentially two theories about its derivation. According to one theory, it's an abbreviation of chicane, whose original meaning is something like being informed of a clever trick, to get somebody entangled in a court submission. And according to the other theory, chic is the original form of schick, that is German word for, which came from schicken. Like geschikt, it had thus the meaning of ingenuity in all things, and that would correspond to some degree to the Swedish word skick, S-K-I-C-K, I imagine. End of quote. Finally, there is considerable comic relief in imagining how the philosopher of the Black Forest fell prey to an intellectual impostor as admirable and as daring as Kuki Shuzo must have been, or in thinking that Frau Kuki, who, as we read, was so welcome in Martin's and Elfriede's home, might very well have been a Parisian prostitute dressing as a Japanese noblewoman. On the other hand, to deduce from Heidegger's provincialism and from Kuki's lack of academic formality, to deduce from the anecdotes that surround the dialogue on language, that this text must be a failure as a philosophical experiment, and that the mutual intuition of a convergence between Japanese thought and Heidegger's philosophy was an illusion, would be to draw conclusions so hermeneutically naive that they would beat even Heidegger's social naivete. Although the Gespräch conveys the impression that in their actual conversation, Kuki must have shamelessly exaggerated the importance of Heidegger's work for his own, and although Heidegger cannot have read Reflections on Japanese states, some of Kuki's observations on Ikki could have been pertinent for his project of overcoming metaphysics. Above all, it would have been noteworthy in relation to an understanding of nothingness as the absence of distinctions, forms, and meanings. That is, as the simultaneity of everything with everything. And that throughout his book, Kuki Shuzo is struggling to explain how the style of the geishas display a simultaneous presence of different qualities which, in the actual appearance, cannot be separated, and for which to find a descriptive concept is an even more hopeless undertaking. Ikki can be analyzed into individual conceptual moments, but we cannot in reverse constitute the being of Ikki with them. Take coquetry or self-respect or resignation. These concepts are not part of Ikki. They are no more than its conceptual moments. For this reason, there is an unsurmountable gap between the Ikki as an assembly of conceptual moments and the Ikki as an experiential meaning. In a different chapter, Kuki insists that the geisha style of behavior absorbs and carries numberless couples of opposite concept: refined versus unrefined, showy versus subdued, chic versus conventional, astringent versus sweet, and so on. He then, quite successfully, proceeds to represent their simultaneity through geometrical figures that connect all of those different concepts and features. A different and equally important level of observation that Kuki himself does not seem to come to terms with produces the impression that all the manifestations of Ikki, despite their extraordinary complexity, remain strangely non-substantial. Ikki thus becomes a term like the vague raffiné. What if Ikki were hypothetically to be something with no more than this sort of vague meaning? Count Kuki, in his attempts of determining the ontological status of Ikki, was oscillating between descriptions of Ikki as sheer material concreteness and other descriptions of Ikki as pure phenomena of consciousness. It is not impossible that Kuki may have talked about this very problem to Heidegger, and that such knowledge was behind the inquirer's conviction in the dialogue on language that Kuki's concept of Ikki was trapped in and suffering from. a misrepresentation through the Western metaphysical paradigm. Another quote here from the book. Inquirer, Cookie spoke of sensuous radiance through whose lively delight there breaks the radiance of something suprasensus. Japanese, with that explanation, I believe Cookie has hit on what we experience in Japanese art. Inquirer, your experience then moves within the difference between a sensuous and a suprasensuous world. This is the distinction on which rests what long has been called Western metaphysics. That is the difference between a sensuous and suprasensuous world. In reaction to this dialogical moment of disillusionment, where it looks for a moment as if Japanese culture could not provide an alternative to the metaphysical paradigm, the inquirer proceeds on the following pages to lay out Heidegger's ideas about a non-metaphysical mode of experiencing the world. Perhaps these ideas can be tied together as a sequence of three different simultaneity claims. The first simultaneity claim is connected to that concept of the twofold, whose explication we had postponed at an earlier stage of our augmentation. The twofold is the non-metaphysical simultaneity, the co-presence of being, Sein, and beings, Seiendes. Another quote, what matters is to bring out the being of beings, though no longer in the manner of the metaphysics, but such that being itself will shine out. Being itself, that is to say, the presence of present beings, the twofold of the two in virtue of their simple otherness. End of quote. Seiendes, as every reader of Heidegger knows, refers to our primary experience of the world, to an experience in which the world always appears as already structured and therefore meaningful, or interpreted. The concept of Sein, in contrast, owes its notorious complexity to a double de-differentiation, in other words, to the simultaneity of the two intrinsic simultaneity effects. Both these de-differentiations can be read as answers to our initial question, that is to the Zen question, to the anti-metaphysical question about the possibility of repressing or minimizing sense and meaning effects in our contact with the world. The first de-differentiation and the second simultaneity claim is the absence of any distinction or forms within Sein. This is the type of simultaneity that we mentioned before in our first attempt to explain the concept of nirvana, or nothingness. Now the inquirer Heidegger indeed defines Sein and nothingness as synonymous concepts, and he adds a third simultaneity claim, a second de-differentiation, the simultaneity within Sein, the non-distinctness between that which is present and that which is absent. The decisive passage of the Gespräch begins with a reference to the third simultaneity claim. Quote again. Inquirer, that emptiness then is the same as nothingness, that essential being which we attempt to add in our thinking as the other to all that is present and absent. Japanese, surely, to us emptiness is the loftiest name for what you mean to say with the word being. In a thinking inquirer, in a thinking attempt whose first steps are unavoidable even to this day, it did, however, become the occasion for very great confusion, a confusion grounded in the matter itself and linked with the use of the name being. For this name belongs, after all, to the patrimony of language of metaphysics. While I put that word into the title of an essay which brings out the essence of metaphysics and only thus brings metaphysics back within its own limit. End of quote. It must be emphasized that, beyond the conclusion that we drew in our first discussion of nothingness, the full meaning of the concept of nothingness / sign, as we now have to add, is not just non-distinctness, non-conceptuality, non-formedness. The concept of sign also contains the non-distinctness between presence and absence. Sein is not pure absence of dividing lines. That is an absence of forms, and herefore of sense. Sein includes, in addition, the non-distinctness of presence and absence, and has to be more than just the appearance of the possibility of a form merging out of non-formedness. It also needs to be an epiphany, which means it needs to be, together with the appearance of a possibility of form, the appearance of a possibility of presence, which then of course includes the possibility of absence. Interpreter: what matter then still does is to bring out the being of beings, though no longer in the manner of metaphysics, but such that being itself, that is to say, the presence of present beings, the twofold fold of the two in virtue of their simple oneness. This is what makes its claim on man, calling him to its essential being. End of quote. This is a systematic place where Heidegger's endeavor of overcoming the metaphysical paradigm, he would of course not have simply spoken of overcoming, meets the more existential motifs of his philosophy. Experiencing, keeping, shepherding, according to a Peter Sloterdijk interpretation, the twofold of being, Seiendes, and being, Sein, in its intrinsic complexity, to give, together with the composure, Gelassenheit, which lets this happen, define human existence, Dasein, and are its destiny. But to this I can add, it is like we in Western metaphysics, we're not happy with simply presence or simply essence. We add something else. We make a frontier, so we try to delineate. And why that started once upon a time is impossible to say. And once you discover it, you understand it's completely weird. But as long as we don't put any words to it, or as long as we don't sort of understand it, it will not be weird to us. But once we get an understanding, it will be completely alien, it will be unheimlich, it will be so weird that you will not be able to understand how it came about. But it's a little bit like you're not happy with the thing that is in front of you. An object, you can refer to it, you can point to it, you can talk about it, you can use it, you can do everything. And then you put another object in its place. And of course this cannot be done, but this is what we're trying to do in the Western metaphysical tradition. And we become used to it. That's the only reason. That it doesn't have any rationale to it. Its lack of rationale is its strong feature. This is why it can work. Its downput is the lack of energy, its lack of directionality. but its complete lack of any excuse for itself could, so to speak, be the starting point of Western rationalism, that there is something buried under all of the rational, and that is very far from rational. It has to be because it's pre-rational, but it will also be unheimlich, it will be scary, not feeling right in any circumstance. It's the same as thinking about the Klein bottle. That shows the true features of space. These are the features of space you need to know, being able to move about, to localize, to refer, and to compare. Let us assume that we are using a three-dimension picture. We're not, because that's impossible. Nothing of that sort can be imagined. We don't live in a non-Euclidean space. But imagine we could. Then that space would be derivative from the bigger Klein bottle logic space, so to speak. And nothing would make sense anymore. Or it would make somewhat of a sense. It wouldn't be perfected. It would be the best likened to giving GPS points on a wrong map to someone. This is exactly what we're doing in Western metaphysics. And I think we don't suspect that to be on the bottom, so to speak. And that lack of being prepared for the worst makes it harder to understand. I would definitely think this story, in an elegant way, by Hans Ulrich, tries to go into that matter, how it can be that there is an absurdity at the bottom, and nothing gets helped by that absurdity. We think that rationality is something of a in itself is lacking, but it's not. Rationality is okay. It is its birthplace, and rationality cannot be used until we understand that birthplace. It can be used to a certain degree, but not to all its extent. Our striving to give rationality origin, that therein lies the problem, not with rationality itself, not with the ability to think. Actually, what we hinder is the ability to think in a rational way, in a structured and organized. And this I've taken up in a couple of lectures, that projection. This is the structuring. And Western metaphysics hate structure. For some reason, it needs to be happenstantial. It gets bored otherwise. We just think that we are very sequential and correct, while we're not. When we point into the list of correctness, we do that in a very sloppy manner. There is a sloppiness because that sloppiness needs to be there because we don't have any energy to perform the act. We have like a non-working tool, and for that tool to be kept doing its mischievous or not very effective work, it needs to be sloppy done, not accurate. Well, it was a rather long lecture. I hope you had some givens there. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye. Let's end with some beautiful flowers here.